Welcome to the Silent Personality Stomp. We step into a life that looked, from a distance, like a crown glittering under 1,000 lights, and felt, from the inside, like a room where every door is watched. This is the story of Edward, born to duty, adored by crowds, restless in his own skin, who became king for a moment and then chose, with one decision, to change the British monarchy forever. Picture the end of the Victorian age fading into a new century that thinks faster, travels farther, and questions more boldly. In a grand house in Richmond, in the year 1994. No, pause, listen carefully, because in this story precision matters. Edward was born in the year 1894, on a summer day in June, into the closest circle of power in Britain. He arrived not as a private child, but as a public future. His name was long, ceremonial, and heavy with ancestry. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. Inside the family, he was David. Outside, he was watched from the start like a symbol in a glass case. His father was George, Duke of York, a man shaped by naval discipline and a stubborn sense of duty. His mother was Mary of Teck, steady, formal, and intensely devoted to the idea of monarchy as service and example. In that household, affection existed, but it moved through rules. The nursery had rhythms. Schedules replaced spontaneity. To be royal was to be trained, and the training began early. How to stand, how to speak, how to be seen, how not to reveal too much of what you felt. The child learned quickly that the world did not belong to him. He belonged to the world. Edward grew into a boy who could charm without trying, who sensed the mood of a room almost before he entered it. But charm was not the same as comfort. From an early age, he did not fit easily into the mold his parents admired. His father valued restraint and routine. Edward leaned toward excitement and movement. His mother believed in distance as dignity. Edward drew energy from closeness, especially from the attention of others. Where the older generation wanted the monarchy to remain slightly unapproachable, he seemed to want to make it immediate, modern, alive. Education for a prince was never merely education. It was preparation to be an institution. Edward was taught by tutors and sent through the expected paths, including the Royal Naval College at Osborne and then Dartmouth, and later to Oxford in a carefully arranged way. But what mattered most was not the classroom. It was the role that waited like a stage set behind the curtains. When his grandfather Edward VII died, Edward's father became the heir to the throne, and the boy became directly in line. When Queen Victoria's long shadow finally gave way to a new age, the future king was no longer an abstract idea. He was a living teenager being measured, photographed, and discussed. Then the world cracked open with war. When the First World War arrived, it arrived with marching songs and casualty lists, with patriotic certainty that quickly turned into something darker and more exhausted. Edward wanted, fiercely, to serve at the front like other young men of his generation. He was a soldier by rank and training, and he visited troops, inspected units, moved among camps and hospitals. But he was also valuable as a symbol to be risked in the trenches. The fear was simple: if the heir to the throne were captured or killed, the consequences would go far beyond one family. So Edward's war became a war of presence rather than combat. He saw the wounded. He walked through mud and devastation on visits. He heard the bitterness, the grief, the strange humor soldiers used to survive. In those years, he learned something that would never leave him: the distance between public rhetoric and private reality, between the speeches of leaders and the lives of ordinary men. That education, raw, human, immediate, affected him more than any lecture hall. When the war ended, the old world did not return. Empires trembled, economies shook. Entire societies tried to understand how they could have sacrificed so much and still feel uncertain about the future. In Britain, the monarchy needed to adapt without appearing to bend. And in that moment, Edward, Prince of Wales, became the brightest asset the royal family had. He was young, tall, stylish, and magnetic. Newspapers loved him. Crowds surged to see him. He traveled across Britain and across the empire, speaking to miners, factory workers, veterans, and civic leaders. He went where kings and princes had not always gone. He did it with a natural ease that made people feel, for a moment, that royalty could be close enough to touch. In an era when the public was learning to live with radio, film, mass photography, and celebrity culture, Edward fit the new world. He looked modern without trying. He moved like someone who belonged to the age of cameras. But the same qualities that made him popular also made him unsettling to the court and to politicians. Edward did not always hide his opinions. He saw unemployment and poverty during the interwar years and reacted with an impatience that did not fit the careful neutrality expected of a constitutional heir. He visited distressed areas and made remarks that sounded compassionate to some, reckless to others. There were moments when he seemed to imply that government should do more, faster, and instinct that, while human, risked drawing the monarchy into political argument. Those around him, especially the officials whose job it was to protect the crown, began to see a pattern. Edward was not naturally comfortable with being restrained. There was another pattern too, quieter at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. Edward's private life did not resemble the fairy tale script many expected for a prince. The public loved romance as a story, but royalty required a specific kind of romance, a suitable bride, ideally young, aristocratic, and uncontroversial, prepared to embody stability. Edward, however, was drawn to older, sophisticated women, often married, often experienced in the social world of London and beyond. These relationships were not merely gossip. They revealed something about him. He was seeking not just affection, but understanding, companionship, and perhaps a sense of control over his own life, something he rarely had in his official role. To some, those relationships were proof of immaturity. To others, they were evidence of a deep loneliness behind the glamour. A prince can be surrounded and still feel isolated, because every friendship is filtered through status, every conversation through caution, every gesture through protocol. Edward found relief in people who spoke to him without reverence, who teased him, who made him feel like David rather than the Prince of Wales. As the 1920s moved into the 1930s, the stakes around his private choices grew sharper. Britain faced economic depression, labor unrest, and political anxieties. Across Europe, extreme ideologies gained momentum. The monarchy, in such conditions, needed to project steadiness. Edward, meanwhile, increasingly pursued personal freedom in ways that alarmed the palace. And then, into his life, came Wallis. Wallis Simpson was an American woman, sharp-witted and socially adept, whose presence would become one of the most consequential forces in modern royal history. She was not born into British aristocracy. She had already been married once and later married Ernest Simpson, a British-American businessman. When Edward met her, she moved within fashionable circles where titles mixed with money, where conversation could be both playful and ruthless, where everyone understood that influence did not always announce itself. What Edward felt for Wallis did not arrive as a simple crush. It deepened, shaped by his temperament and by the particular moment he was living in. He was a man trained to be watched, hungry to be known. Wallis, with her confidence and her refusal to be dazzled by his rank, offered him a different kind of mirror. She could criticize him. She could direct him. She could provide, in a way, the structure he resisted from the palace. Only this time it came with intimacy, not obligation. Their relationship intensified as Europe darkened, but even before the crisis that would make them famous, there was a quieter conflict unfolding. The British establishment did not merely disapprove of Wallis, it saw her as incompatible with what the monarchy represented. Divorce carried a stigma far stronger then than it does now, especially in the social and religious environment of Britain's ruling class. The monarch was not only a political figure, the monarch was also supreme governor of the Church of England, an office bound to religious expectations. A king who married a divorced woman with a living former husband was, to many, unthinkable, not simply scandalous, but constitutionally and spiritually disruptive. Edward, however, moved closer to the point of no return, and the machinery of the state began to tense. Then came the death of George V. George V died in January of the year 1936. With his death, Edward became king. The transition that should have felt like destiny fulfilled instead arrived as a collision. The man who had spent years resisting restraint now held the one position in which restraint was most essential. At the beginning, many people believed he would succeed brilliantly. He was popular. He understood the modern media landscape. He seemed to connect with the public in a direct way. Yet from the first months of his reign, signs of trouble appeared. Court routines irritated him. Paperwork bored him. Traditional ceremonies felt like cages. And always in the background was the central fact: he was emotionally committed to Wallis Simpson, and he wanted her not just as a companion, but as his wife.